The Mercer farm sat at the edge of a county that had been slowly forgetting itself for years. The soil that had once fed 3 generations of the family had grown thin and stubborn, the kind of dirt that took everything you put into it and gave back just enough to keep you desperate. The fences needed mending. The paint on the porch had peeled down to gray, weathered wood. The barn leaned slightly to the left, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. But none of that was what people noticed when they came to call on the Mercer property. What they noticed, what everyone in Caldwell County, Missouri noticed, were the Mercer girls. There were 3 of them. Arabella was the eldest, 23 years old, and built like a portrait you might find hanging in a fine home back east. She had copper-red hair that caught sunlight like it had been specifically arranged to do so, green eyes that men described in letters home, and a laugh that carried across a room and made everyone in it feel like they'd been let into something private and wonderful. Arabella had turned down 2 proposals already. She was waiting, she said, for the right one. No one doubted she'd find him. Josephine was the middle sister, 19, darker and sharper than Arabella. Less immediately stunning, but dangerous in a way that took people a moment to register. She had their mother's high cheekbones, and a wit so quick it sometimes cut before anyone realized they were bleeding. The boys in town were quietly afraid of her. She enjoyed that. And then there was Eliza. Eliza was 21, which placed her squarely between her sisters in age, but nowhere near them in anything else the world seemed to value. She was not ugly. She would have been the first to say so, on a good day, when she was feeling charitable toward herself. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned back because it refused to do anything interesting if she left it loose. Her eyes were gray, the kind of gray that people described as thoughtful when they were being kind and plain when they were not. She was medium height, medium build. She moved through rooms the way a piece of furniture moves through rooms. Always there, never quite noticed. She did the books for the farm. She was good with numbers, better than anyone in the family acknowledged, and she managed the household accounts with a precision that kept them afloat in years when they should have gone under. She mended things. She remembered things. She was the one who noticed when the milk cow was coming down sick 3 days before anyone else. The one who knew where every tool on the property lived. The one who kept a running record in a leather journal of every debt owed and every debt outstanding. She was, in every practical sense, the reason the Mercer farm still functioned. No one said this out loud. "Eliza, fetch more water. Eliza, the hem on my blue dress needs taking in. Eliza, did you write down what we owe the feed store?" She did all of it. She did it without complaint, mostly, because complaining had never changed anything. And she had learned early that silence was easier to live in than the kind of noise that came from wanting things you couldn't have. Their mother, Harriet Mercer, was a woman who had once been beautiful and had not entirely forgiven the world for allowing that to change. She doted on Arabella with a ferocity that bordered on the obsessive, treated Josephine with a wary respect born from the knowledge that the girl could outmaneuver her if given the chance, and regarded Eliza with the particular blindness of someone who has decided a thing has no value and so stopped looking at it altogether. Their father, Thomas Mercer, was gentle, distracted, and increasingly absent even when he was sitting at the kitchen table. He had a habit of staring out windows at distances he never explained. He was kind to Eliza in the absent way of someone who means well, and never quite gets around to it. He had once, when she was 9 years old, told her she had a good mind. She had never forgotten it. She had also never heard it again. This was the world Eliza Mercer had grown up in. This was the house she moved through like furniture. This was the family that looked right at her and somehow never quite saw her. She was 21 years old, and she had stopped waiting to be noticed. Or so she told herself. It was Josephine who found it. She had been in town on a Thursday, ostensibly to pick up thread and a package of needles from the dry goods store, actually to spend an hour pretending to browse while the young man behind the counter, a nervous fellow named Gerald Finch, worked up the courage to speak to her. She had been doing this for 3 weeks. Gerald had still not spoken. Josephine was beginning to find the whole exercise more entertaining than a conversation would have been. She had, while waiting for Gerald to locate his nerve, flipped through the newspaper left on the counter. It was a Denver paper, 2 weeks old, brought in with a shipment of goods. Most of it held no interest for her. But on the 3rd page, sandwiched between an advertisement for Dr. Hadley's tonic water and a notice about a church social, was a small announcement in plain print. Sought, A capable woman of good character, willing to relocate to Wyoming territory for the purpose of matrimony. Applicant must be industrious, of sound health, and willing to assume responsibility for household management of a working cattle ranch. Widower, age 32 with one child. Correspondence may be directed to C. Hale, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. Josephine had read it twice. Then she had torn it out of the paper. She would feel briefly guilty about this later, then stop. Folded it into her pocket and walked home faster than she'd walked anywhere in recent memory. She had an idea. The idea was not kind. She told Arabella about it that evening, in the bedroom they shared, with the door closed against the sound of Eliza doing dishes in the kitchen below. Arabella's response, once she'd read it, was a slow smile. A mail-order bride advertisement. For a widower in Wyoming, Josephine said, with a child on a cattle ranch. It's practically a sentence, Arabella said, a prison sentence. I thought, Josephine said, keeping her voice light and amused, the way she kept all her more vicious ideas, that we might help Eliza find some adventure. The smile on Arabella's face did something complicated. There was a moment, brief, barely a second, where something passed across her eyes that might, in another woman, have been discomfort. Then it was gone. You want to submit her name. I want to expand her horizons. They both understood that these were not the same thing. They proceeded anyway. It took Josephine about 20 minutes to compose the letter. She was good at writing, precise, clear, just the right amount of warmth without being maudlin. She described a woman named Eliza Mercer, age 21, of good health and sober character, experienced in household management and farm accounting. She mentioned the Missouri farm. She mentioned a willingness to relocate. She signed Eliza's name in a close approximation of her sister's handwriting, which she had been watching for years and which she reproduced without much difficulty. She sealed the letters. She mailed it the next morning before she could change her mind, which she was not going to do anyway. Then she and Arabella waited. They had not, either of them, genuinely expected a response. That was the joke, you understand. The punchline they'd been constructing in their heads was the image of Eliza receiving a letter from some desperate, rough-mannered stranger in Wyoming and having to explain that she hadn't actually, that it was a mistake, that she didn't, watching her flush red with humiliation and stammer through the whole embarrassing mess. That was what they'd paid for when they mailed that letter. What arrived 3 weeks later was not what they'd ordered. The letter came on a Tuesday. Eliza was the one who collected the mail because Eliza was the one who collected most things that required going to the road, and she came back into the kitchen with a small stack of envelopes she set on the table without looking at carefully. Bills, she assumed. There was always something. She was halfway through sorting them when she saw her name on one she didn't recognize. The return address was in Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. The handwriting was plain and direct. No curly cues, no excess. Just letters forming words forming her name. Miss Eliza Mercer. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment with the envelope in her hands, not opening it, just holding it with the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to get ahead of themselves. Then she opened it. Dear Miss Mercer, I received your letter and have given it consideration. I am not a man who uses many words when fewer will do, so I will be plain with you. I am 32 years old. I own and operate a cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory, approximately 40 miles southeast of Cheyenne. The operation runs 1,200 head of cattle, employs 11 men, and covers 4,200 acres. My wife passed 3 years ago. I have a son, Eli, who is 7 years old. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a capable woman who understands work, who can manage a household in a difficult climate, and who will treat my son with decency. I am not a charming man, and I make no pretense of being one. I am, however, reliable, honest, and I do not raise my hand to women or children. If this arrangement holds any interest for you, I would ask that you write back with your genuine assessment of what you can offer and what you expect in return. I have no interest in flattery from either direction. Respectfully, Colton Hale. Eliza read the letter once, then she read it again. She was still reading it, or rather staring at it, when Josephine came into the kitchen for a glass of water and made the mistake of asking what she was looking at. Eliza looked up slowly. There was something in her face that Josephine wasn't used to seeing there, a focused quality, like a lens being adjusted. Why, Eliza said, very quietly. Does a man in Wyoming territory have my address? The color that came up in Josephine's face was answer enough. What followed was not a quiet conversation. Arabella was called in. Their mother appeared at the doorway at some point, heard enough to understand the broad shape of it, and chose in characteristic fashion to say that this sort of thing was what came of girls who didn't know their place, and that it was all very embarrassing, and would someone please close the kitchen window because the draft was giving her a headache. Josephine, to give her limited credit, did not lie about it. She was honest in the way that someone is honest when they've been caught, and denial has become more work than the truth. She said it had been a joke. She said she hadn't thought anyone would actually respond. She said she certainly hadn't expected a letter like that. What kind of letter did you expect? Eliza asked. Something, I don't know, desperate, pathetic. Josephine had the grace to look at the floor when she said this. Not, she gestured vaguely at the letter in Eliza's hands. Not someone like him, Eliza said. I wasn't trying to. Yes, you were, Eliza said. You were. She left the kitchen with the letter. She went up to her room, a narrow room at the back of the house that got morning light and afternoon shadow, and she sat on the edge of her bed and she read the letter a third time. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a capable woman. She had been capable her entire life. She had been capable in this house, on this farm, for as long as she could remember, and no one had ever used that word about her like it meant something worth having. He had used it like a credential, like something that mattered. I am, however, reliable, honest, and I do not raise my hand to women or children. A low bar, she thought. But she had known men who couldn't clear it. She sat with the letter for a long time. The household carried on for 2 days as though nothing had happened, which was the Mercer family's primary method of handling discomfort. Their mother made a pointed remark at supper about foolish girls and foolish ideas, and how certain people ought to be grateful for what they had. Josephine was quieter than usual, which was not quiet at all, but was quieter than Josephine. Arabella was elaborately normal, which was its own kind of message. Eliza did the dishes. She fed the chickens. She updated the household accounts. She went to sleep and woke up and did it all again. On the morning of the third day, she sat down at the writing desk in the parlor, the good desk, the one she almost never used because it technically belonged to a parlor that was technically for guests, and she wrote a letter. It took her 4 drafts. The first was too stiff, too formal, like she was applying for a position at a bank. The second was too earnest, too much of her actual thinking bleeding through in ways that felt embarrassing on paper. The third was somewhere between the two but kept trailing off at the end like she wasn't sure she meant what she was saying. The 4th draft she wrote without stopping and without crossing anything out. And when she reached the end and read it back, she thought, yes, that's honest. Dear Mr. Hale, I will also be plain. Your letter was written to a version of me my sisters invented, which I expect you have a right to know. They submitted my name without my knowledge, as a prank. I do not think it was a kind thing to do, but it is done, and here we are. I'm not going to pretend to be what they described. I am 21, and I am not beautiful. I say this not for sympathy but for accuracy, because I assume you receive letters from women who oversell themselves, and I'd rather spare us both that. I have kept accounts for our farm for 4 years. I can manage a household, preserve food, care for animals, and work without supervision. I am in good health. I do not scare easily, or at least I don't let it show. I have never been to Wyoming. What I would expect, to be treated as a person of some sense, not as a decoration or a servant. To have honest information about what the work requires. To not be dismissed on sight. What I can offer, I will work hard. I will be honest with you. I will treat your son with care. I will not be a burden. This is, I think, a reasonable basis for correspondence if you care to continue it. Respectfully, Eliza Mercer. She folded it. She addressed the envelope. She walked to town and mailed it before she could think about it too carefully, which was the only way she had ever done anything brave. His response came in 11 days, which she had calculated was the minimum reasonable time for a letter to travel to Wyoming and back. She had not counted the days. She had counted the days. Dear Miss Mercer, your honesty is noted and appreciated. I have received letters from women who were not honest, and I can tell the difference. I am not looking for beautiful. I am looking for capable and steady, and someone who will not leave when the first winter hits. If you are those things, I have no use for anything else. Regarding your sisters, what they did was a cruelty. I say that not to make you feel worse about it, but because it is true, and I don't see any reason to pretend otherwise. You did not deserve it. I'm attaching the terms I am prepared to offer. They are fair. I have had them reviewed by the minister in Cheyenne, who is a decent man and not a fool. If you find them acceptable, I am prepared to proceed. If you come, you should know what you are coming into. The nearest town is 14 miles. Winters are severe. The work is real. I will not dress any of that up for you. I would like you to come. Respectfully, Sito. Hail Eliza sat with that last line for a long time. I would like you to come. Not flowery, not romantic, not the words a man wrote in a novel. Just a plain statement of fact, put down without decoration, meaning exactly what it said. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark, listening to the farm settle around her. The creak of old wood, the distant sound of one of the horses moving in the barn, her sister's voices somewhere below, talking about something that had nothing to do with her. And she thought about it all very carefully. She thought about 14 miles to town. She thought about real winters and real work. She thought about a 7-year-old boy she'd never met and a man she knew only in straight, unadorned sentences. She thought about this house, about the account books no one thanked her for, about her name being written down as a joke and mailed across the country to a stranger, about the way her mother had looked at her across the supper table the other night. Not angry, not concerned, just through her. Like she wasn't entirely there. She fell asleep before she made the decision, but she woke up already knowing what it was. She did not make a scene of it. She had considered it briefly. There had been a version of this in her head at 3 a.m, 2 days before she left, where she said everything she'd never said to her mother, to Arabella, to Josephine, where she laid out in precise and cutting terms exactly what each of them had taken from her and never acknowledged. It was a satisfying thing to imagine. She didn't do it. Not because she was afraid of conflict. She had learned to manage her fear reasonably well. But because she understood with a clarity that came from years of quiet observation that it would change nothing. They would defend themselves. Her mother would cry. Arabella would be wounded and beautiful about it. Josephine might actually feel bad, which was the most unpredictable outcome, and therefore the most dangerous. And at the end of it, she would still be leaving, and they would still be exactly who they were. Some things you just had to walk away from without the speech. She packed one trunk. She was ruthless about it. Took only what was genuinely hers, left behind anything she'd acquired through the household. She packed her 2 best dresses and 1 work dress, her boots, her underclothes, her sewing kit, the leather journal she kept her accounts in, 3 books, and her mother's second-best brooch, which Harriet had given her 4 Christmases ago and which had been sitting in Eliza's drawer unworn because there was never anywhere worth wearing it. She was going to wear it now. She wrote a letter to her father and left it on his workbench in the barn, where she knew he'd find it before anyone else. She said she was going to Wyoming to be married, that she was not in any danger, and that she had made the decision of her own free will. She told him she loved him. She told him she hoped he remembered what she'd said in the letter when her mother was upset, because there was nothing he could do, and getting upset alongside her would not help either of them. She told him the account books were in the second drawer of the writing desk and that everything was current through the end of the month. She thanked him for telling her she had a good mind when she was 9 years old. She walked to the train station in the early morning before breakfast, while her sisters were still asleep. The air was cool and smelled like turned earth and something green that she couldn't name. She had $14.60, the money she'd saved from what little the farm could spare, and a ticket she'd purchased 3 days ago and kept folded in her boot ever since. The station master, a heavy-set man named Morris, who had known the Mercer family for years, looked at her trunk and her single bag and her brooch and her expression and said, "You going far?" "Wyoming," she said. "Alone?" "Yes." He seemed to consider asking more. He decided against it. He helped her load her trunk. She boarded the train without looking back. That was not entirely true. She did look back once, a single glance at the road she'd come down, the direction of the farm, the ordinary morning sky above Missouri. It was not a nostalgic look. It was more like checking that the door was closed. Then she turned and found her seat and watched the fields start to move. The train took 2 days and 1 night, with a change in Kansas City and another in Cheyenne. Eliza had never traveled alone before. She discovered that this was something she was capable of, which was not entirely a surprise but was still useful to confirm. She ate what she'd packed, bread and cheese and dried apple slices, carefully wrapped, because she had enough money to eat in the dining car but not so much that she could afford to do it carelessly. She spoke when spoken to and kept her face neutral, in the way that women learn to do when they're traveling alone and don't want to invite conversation from people they haven't chosen. In Kansas City, during the 2-hour layover, she walked out of the station and stood on a street corner she didn't know and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. It was considerable. She had left her family's home with one trunk, $14, and the name of a man she'd never met for a place she'd never been, to do a thing she had never planned on doing. She also, she noticed, standing on that corner in the Kansas City afternoon, did not feel afraid in the way she'd expected. There was something else there instead. Something small and strange that she hadn't felt in long enough that she took a moment to identify it. It was possibility. The specific, uncomfortable, exhilarating sensation of not knowing what came next and having that mean room rather than threat. She went back into the station. She bought herself a cup of coffee, which was a small luxury she allowed herself, and she sat with it and with the noise of the station around her, and she thought, all right then, let's see. The last leg of the journey was the hardest. Wyoming was vast in a way that she understood intellectually from maps, but had not prepared herself for in any meaningful way. When the landscape outside the train window shifted from the familiar flatness of the Missouri River Valley into something larger and more serious, the kind of country that didn't seem to notice you were in it, she felt small in a new way. Not the smallness of being overlooked, a different smallness. The smallness of standing next to something enormous and understanding your actual size. She found that she didn't hate it. At the station in Laramie County, she stepped off the train into late afternoon light that was unlike any light she had ever seen. Thinner, somehow, and colder, with a quality that made everything look slightly more real than it had any right to. Her trunk was unloaded. She stood on the platform and looked around at the small collection of buildings, the unpaved street, the mountains in the distance that she'd seen on no map she'd ever studied. She had been told she would be met. She waited 12 minutes, which she counted, and then a buckboard wagon came around the far end of the street, pulled by 2 dark horses, driven by a man she had not yet met but recognized instantly from the shape of his posture, straight, no excess, and the unhurried way he handled the reins. She thought, so, that's him. He pulled up to the platform and looked at her, and she looked at him, and it was a moment without much pretense in it because neither of them were people who went in for pretense. Colton Hale was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something rougher, she supposed, something that matched the blunt economy of his writing. He was rough, certainly. His face was weathered in the way of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something hard. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed plainly in a dark coat and work-worn boots. He had dark hair under a hat that had seen weather. His eyes, when they found hers, were the particular color of the high Wyoming sky in winter, a pale, serious gray. He was, she thought despite herself, a striking-looking man. She filed this away as irrelevant and kept her face neutral. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. He got down from the wagon without ceremony and came to take her trunk. He was efficient about it. 2 hands, lifted clean, settled into the wagon bed without drama. He didn't comment on the size of it or ask if she needed help with anything else. "Long trip," he said. "Yes," she said. "Hungry?" "Somewhat. There's food at the ranch. About an hour's drive." He looked at her once more, a direct, unvarnished look that was assessing without being unkind. "You're smaller than I expected." "Most people are," she said, "when you only know them from letters." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the precursor to one, the shadow of the idea. "Fair enough," he said, and went around to the other side of the wagon. She climbed up before he could help her because she wasn't starting this, whatever it was, by being helped onto a wagon. He noticed this. He didn't say anything about it. He gathered the reins and set the horses moving, and they drove out of town in the thin Wyoming light, and the mountain sat against the horizon like they'd been there since before time had opinions about itself. Eliza held her hands in her lap and watched the country go by and thought, all right, Here we are. The ranch was further than an hour, because a wheel hit a rock in a rut about 40 minutes out, and Colton had to stop and check it. And while he was doing that, she climbed down without being asked and held the horses, which she could see he'd been about to ask her to do. He looked at her from beside the wheel with the same measured expression. "You're not what I expected either," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it genuinely before answering, which she noted. "Someone more frightened," he said finally. "Most people are. First time they see this country." "I've been frightened before," Eliza said. "I just don't see the point in showing it to strangers." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he went back to the wheel. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a silence with something different in it than the silence she'd grown up in. That silence had been the absence of being seen. This silence was two people deciding independently and without discussion to reserve judgment. It was a better kind of quiet. The ranch appeared over a low rise as the sun was finishing its business with the sky, and Eliza saw it in the last gold light, sprawling, functional, nothing beautiful about it except the way it sat in the landscape like it meant to be there. A large main house in dark timber, a barn that was easily 4 times the size of the one at the Mercer farm, outbuildings she'd identify later, a corral where horses moved in the half-dark. Standing on the porch of the main house, silhouetted against the light from inside, was a small figure. 7 years old, she thought. That would be Eli. The boy didn't move from the porch as they pulled up. He was watching her with the particular intensity of a child who has been waiting and who has decided he is not going to seem like he's been waiting. She climbed down from the wagon and looked up at him. "You must be Eli," she said. He stared at her. He had his father's coloring, the dark hair, the serious eyes, and a wariness around his mouth that was too old for his face. "You're from Missouri," he said. "Yes." "Is it flat there?" "Very flat," she said. "Nothing like this." He considered her for another moment, weighing something she couldn't see the scales of. "Papa said you were coming to stay," he said. He said it wasn't definite. She glanced back at Colton, who had come around the wagon and was watching this exchange with his arms at his sides and nothing particularly readable on his face. "That's true," Eliza said, returning her attention to the boy. "Not definite yet." "Why not?" "We haven't decided if we suit each other yet, your father and I." Eli absorbed this with the gravity of a child who has had to understand adult things before he was entirely ready for them. "What if you don't?" "Then I'll go home," she said. "But I don't think that's going to happen." "How do you know?" "I don't," she said honestly. "But I'm not in the habit of coming all this way for nothing." Something shifted in the boy's face. Not quite trust. Trust was going to take considerably longer. But the specific recognition that she had answered him straight, without the softening or deflecting that adults used on children when they wanted to avoid the actual question. "Supper's been keeping warm," he said, and went inside. Colton came to stand beside her on the porch steps, looking at the door his son had gone through. "He'll come around," he said. "He doesn't need to come around," Eliza said. "He needs to see whether I'm worth trusting. That's different." Another long pause. Another one of those not-quite-smile expressions. "Supper's inside," he said. She went in. The house smelled like wood smoke and something meat-based that had been cooking slowly, and it was not the warmth of a house that had been recently full of life. It was the warmth of a house that had been maintained by discipline rather than by love. Warm because someone had made sure it was warm, and for no other reason. There were functional pieces of furniture, sturdy and without decoration. A rack of tools near the door arranged with military precision. A table set for 3, which someone had done this morning in anticipation of her arrival. She sat down at the table. Eli appeared with a pot of beans from the back of the stove with the careful concentration of a child who has been given a job and has decided to do it well. Colton brought bread and a platter of what turned out to be reasonably good roasted beef. They ate. The first meal was almost entirely silent, punctuated by the sound of the fire and the distant shift of horses in the barn. But it was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of 3 people being very careful, which was appropriate, and of 2 adults who had written their truths to each other and were now in the strange position of occupying the same room as those truths. Eliza ate 2 portions of the beans because she was genuinely hungry and because she had decided somewhere on the train that she was going to stop performing modesty in the ways women were trained to perform it when men were watching. When supper was done, Colton showed her to a room at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was small and clean and had a window that looked east toward a line of low hills. There was a bed with a quilt, a washstand, a chair. "This is yours," he said. "For now. All right," she said. He started to leave. He was at the door when she said, "Mr. Hale." He turned. "Thank you," she said, "for writing back, and for—" She looked at the room, at the window, at the quilt that someone had folded over the foot of the bed with evident care. "For the consideration." He was quiet for a moment. "You made a brave decision," he said. "Harder one than mine." Then he was gone, his footsteps down the hall steady and even, and she heard a door close somewhere, and then the house was quiet. Eliza stood in her room in Wyoming territory with her single trunk beside her and her mother's brooch still on her dress and the long day of the journey settling into her bones, and she stood at the window and looked out at the dark hills and the extravagant, merciless sky, and she felt something she had no immediate name for. Not happiness, exactly. Not relief. Something closer to landing. The feeling of something that has been moving for a long time finally finding the ground. She unpacked her nightclothes and her journal and her books. She set the journal on the small table by the bed. She sat down in the chair and she let the room be quiet around her, and she didn't think about her sisters or her mother or the account books in the second drawer or the life she'd left behind. She thought about the mountains, which she could see in outline against the stars. She thought, "Plain, they called me. Overlooked." She thought, "All right then, let's see what overlooked can do out here." Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and entirely indifferent to what she was feeling, which was somehow exactly right. She went to bed. She slept without dreaming for the first time in as long as she could remember, and the sleep was deep and full, and without the background noise of a house that didn't quite contain her. And that, in the end, was the most honest measure of where she had landed. For the first time in 21 years, Eliza Mercer slept like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first morning came in through the east window before she was ready for it. Eliza was not a late sleeper by habit. The farm had cured her of that before she was 10, but the light in Wyoming had a different quality than Missouri light, sharper and higher, and without the soft yellow edge of dawn she was used to. It came in like a declaration instead of a suggestion, and she was sitting up before she'd fully decided to be awake. She dressed in her work dress, pinned her hair back the way she always did, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but the stove was already warm, which meant Colton had been up before her. There was coffee in the pot, thick, black, the kind that had been sitting for a while and didn't apologize for it. She poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the ranch yard in the early light. The place was already moving. 2 ranch hands crossed the yard toward the barn, one carrying a feed bucket, the other talking about something she couldn't hear. A dog she hadn't seen the night before was doing slow, deliberate circles near the fence post. The corral held 8 horses, maybe 9, shifting and breathing in the cold. The mountains sat beyond all of it at the edge of the world, white-tipped, unchanged, patient in the way that things are patient when they have been there for 10,000 years and expect to be there for 10,000 more. She drank her coffee and let the strangeness of it settle over her. It was strange, genuinely. She had not been romantic about this. She had not let herself be romantic about anything since she was old enough to understand that romance was a loan that collected interest. But standing in someone else's kitchen in a territory she had never visited, wearing her second-best dress and holding a cup of coffee that wasn't hers, she felt the full weight of the peculiar thing she had done. She had come here. She had simply come. The back door opened and Colton came in, bringing cold air and the smell of the yard with him. He stopped when he saw her standing at the window, not startled exactly, but pausing in the slight way of a man who has grown accustomed to an empty kitchen. "You found the coffee," he said. "Yes. Thank you." He hung his coat on the peg by the door. He was already in work clothes, his hands rough with outdoor cold. He went to the stove and poured his own cup and stood at the counter and drank it the way he seemed to do most things, without excess, without commentary. "Eli'll be down in an hour," he said. "He doesn't rush mornings." "Neither did I at his age," Eliza said. Colton looked at her over his cup. "What changed?" "My mother decided sleeping past 5 o'clock was a moral failure." She said it without bitterness, just as fact. "Takes a while to talk yourself out of someone else's schedule." He made a short sound that might, under different circumstances, have been a laugh. "Breakfast is your call," he said. "I've been making do with bread and whatever's left from supper, but there's flour, eggs, salt pork." She set down her cup. "I'll make something proper." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want something hot." She found the flour in a tin cabinet, the eggs in a covered basket near the cool window, the salt pork hanging in the back pantry. The kitchen was organized in the way of someone who had learned organization out of necessity rather than preference. Everything had a place, but the places weren't always intuitive. She adjusted as she went, noting without comment where she would put things differently. She made Johnny cakes and fried the salt pork and sliced bread, and by the time Eli appeared at the bottom of the stairs, hair uncombed, one boot not fully laced, the particular look of a child who has just conducted an internal debate about whether to come down at all, the kitchen smelled like something that required a decision. The boy stood in the doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at her. "You cooked," he said. "Seemed like the thing to do." She set a plate at his place at the table. "Your boot's not laced." He looked down at his boot as though it had done this without his cooperation. He bent and laced it badly, and then came to the table and sat down and ate with the focused intensity of a 7-year-old who has decided he is hungry regardless of his feelings about the situation. Colton ate across from him in silence. Eliza sat at the far end of the table with her own plate and her second cup of coffee, and the three of them occupied the same meal without much talk, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile. It was what it was, three people learning the shape of being in the same room. After breakfast, Colton told her he needed to be out on the range for most of the day, that a ranch hand named Dunmore would be around the yard if she needed anything, and that she was free to look around the property as she saw fit. He said this last part carefully, not like an invitation but like information, like he wanted her to know the boundaries were open without making it sound like he was testing her. She recognized the distinction and appreciated it. "What does the house need?" she asked. He paused in putting on his coat. "What do you mean?" "Is there mending? Preserving that needs doing? Accounts that are behind?" He looked at her in that measured way he had. "The accounts are on the desk in the front room. I'm not behind, but I'm not ahead either. The rest—" He glanced around the kitchen, and she could see him actually looking at it, maybe for the first time in a while. "Whatever you think needs doing, I'm not going to give you a list." "All right," she said. He left. She heard the horses move outside, the sound of riders going out through the yard. Eli disappeared somewhere into the back of the house, and Eliza stood in the kitchen alone and looked at it properly. The house was clean in the way that things are clean when a man keeps them clean out of discipline. Swept, nothing left out that didn't need to be out, but there was a bareness to it that went beyond tidiness. The walls were empty except for a single small photograph hung near the fireplace in the front room, which she noted but did not approach. There were no curtains on the kitchen windows. The furniture in the sitting room was arranged for function, not for living in. It was the home of someone going through the motions of inhabiting a space without actually inhabiting it. She found the account ledger on the front room desk and spent 2 hours with it, making notes in her own journal in the margin shorthand she'd developed over 4 years of managing the Mercer farm books. Colton's numbers were accurate. She could see that immediately, but they were recorded in a way that made assessment difficult. Entries listed in chronological order without categorical sorting, which meant to understand the state of any particular aspect of the ranch, you had to cross-reference half the book. She didn't reorganize it because it was his system and she had no authority to change it yet. She noted what it would look like if it were sorted differently and kept her notes to herself. At noon, she made sandwiches from the remaining bread and left one on a plate on the back porch where she had seen Eli disappear earlier. She didn't call for him. She left the plate and went back inside, and 15 minutes later the plate was empty. She spent the afternoon doing what she'd said she'd do. She looked around. She walked the yard slowly, introducing herself to the geography of the place. The equipment shed, the 2 water troughs, the root cellar behind the main house, the outhouse, the woodpile that was adequate but would need to be larger before winter by her estimation. She looked at the kitchen garden that had been planted and partially tended and partially left to struggle on its own, and she crouched down and put her hand in the soil and felt what was there. The ranch hand named Dunmore found her there, her hand in the garden dirt, and stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said. She looked up. He was older, 50, maybe, with a face full of the kind of weathering that came from a life spent outside. He had a direct, uncomplicated manner. "Mr. Dunmore," she said, "is there a store of lime anywhere on the property? The soil in this section is too acid." He blinked. "There might be some in the equipment shed, left from whitewashing." "I'll find it," she said, and stood and brushed the dirt off her hands. He watched her for a moment. "You know gardens?" "I know soil," she said. "Same principles whether it's a garden or a field." He nodded, the slow nod of someone filing information under a heading he hadn't expected to create. By the time Colton came back in the last of the evening light, tired in the physical way of a man who has spent all day on horseback and doesn't consider this noteworthy, she had a pot of soup on the stove, the kitchen windows had been cleaned. Eli had helped her somewhat reluctantly sort through the vegetable stores in the root cellar to remove what was going soft, and she had reorganized one section of the pantry shelf that had been bothering her all day. Colton came into the kitchen and stopped, looked at the clean windows, looked at the soup, looked at Eli sitting at the kitchen table with a small pile of dried beans he was supposed to be sorting, and was instead arranging into what appeared to be a battlefield. "Eli," Colton said. "I'm helping," Eli said without looking up. "That doesn't look like helping. The beans need to be sorted." Eli gestured at his arrangement with the authority of a general explaining strategy. "I'm assessing them first." Eliza kept her face still and her eyes on the soup. She heard Colton exhale through his nose in a way that wasn't quite exasperation and wasn't quite amusement, and was somewhere in the middle that you only got to when someone was genuinely, helplessly fond of a small person who was also frequently maddening. Dinner was quieter than breakfast, but easier, the way that second things are easier than first things because the shape of them is already partially known. Colton asked about her day in the way of a man who wants to know, but isn't certain how to ask, and she gave him what he needed without embellishment: the account ledger, the garden, the root cellar. She mentioned the lime for the soil in passing, not as an accomplishment, just as a thing she'd found needed doing. He was quiet for a moment after she mentioned it. "My wife planted that garden," he said. His voice was flat, not emotional, just careful, the way you talk about something that still has edges. "I kept it going, but I don't know much about gardens." "I'll take care of it," she said, equally flat, equally careful. He nodded. That was all. They moved on. That was, she would think later, the first time the house felt like it was breathing. The days built themselves one on top of another in the way that days do when they are full of actual work. She learned the ranch in increments, its rhythms, its needs, the particular personality of a place that had been built by one man over 10 years. She learned which of the ranch hands were reliable and which needed watching, which of the horses were manageable and which would try you on for size before they respected you, which section of the root cellar floor collected damp and which shelves in the kitchen were too warm in summer. She learned these things by paying attention, by asking direct questions when she needed to and keeping her mouth shut when she didn't, by being useful in ways that didn't announce themselves. Eli was the more complicated project. The boy was not unkind. He was something more complex than unkind. He was armored, in the way of a child who had experienced real loss and had constructed around himself a set of habits and distances that worked, more or less, to keep the hurt at a manageable depth. He was not rude to her. He answered questions when she asked them. He did his chores, more or less, when reminded, but he watched her with those serious eyes in a way that said, "I am waiting. I am seeing if you are going to leave." She did not push. She did not try to be warm in a performance of warmth. She was simply present and consistent. There in the morning, there at supper, there when he scraped his knee on the corral fence and sat on the back porch steps holding it and looking at the sky with the profound dignity of a 7-year-old who had decided he was not going to cry. She came out with a clean cloth and knelt beside him without making it into an event. "Let me see," she said. He showed her the knee. It was bad enough to sting, not bad enough to be serious. She cleaned it and wrapped it and sat beside him on the porch step while he looked at the yard. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Some," he said. "Knees heal fast," she said. "Faster than most things." He considered this. Mama used to say that. It was the first time he had mentioned his mother to her directly. She kept her voice steady. "Was she right?" "Usually," he said. He was quiet a moment. She was right about most things. Papa says so. He would know, Eliza said. Eli looked at her sideways, assessing. Do you miss home? She thought about the honest answer to that, because she had decided she was going to give this child honest answers even when they were complicated. Some parts, she said. The way the river smells in spring. My father's garden. She paused. Not most of it. Why not? Because most of it didn't feel like home, she said. Some places look like home and aren't. He sat with that for a while. Then he went inside to find his father, and she stayed on the porch and watched the light change on the mountains. And she thought that was probably the most she'd get from him for a while. And that was all right. A scratch on the knee and a conversation about his mother was more than nothing. It was, in its quiet way, a beginning. The marriage question resolved itself in the way that practical questions between practical people tend to resolve, not in one dramatic conversation, but in an accumulation of smaller ones, each one moving them fractionally closer to a position they had both been circling since she arrived. It was 11 days after she came to the ranch that Colton sat down across from her at the kitchen table in the evening, after Eli was in bed, with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that said he had been thinking about something and had decided to stop thinking and just say it. The minister in town comes through on the last Friday of the month, he said. She looked at him over her cup. Is he trustworthy? He's fair, Colton said. He doesn't pry, and he doesn't gossip. That's the most I ask of a minister. When is the last Friday of the month? 10 days. She set her cup down. And you're asking me if I want to proceed. I'm telling you when the opportunity is, he said. What you do with it is yours. She thought about this for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned to be careful about decisions that looked clear and were actually complicated, and this was one that looked clear. She turned it over. She looked at it from the side, from underneath. She found no hidden complications. The man across from her was serious and blunt and not cruel, and she had seen enough of this place now to know she could do useful things in it. And there was a boy upstairs who needed someone to be steady, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to be that person. 10 days, she said. Thereabouts? All right, she said. He nodded. She saw something in his shoulders, such not relief exactly, something more like the easing of a tension that had been there for a while. There's one thing I want to say, he said. Say it. I know this isn't what you planned for, not the life you imagined, I mean. His voice had the careful quality it took on when he was working to be accurate rather than diplomatic. I know how it started, what your sisters did. I haven't forgotten that. I don't want you to think I see you as a convenience. She looked at him steadily. Do you mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. Then I believe you, she said. And I want to say something in return. Go ahead. I didn't come here because I had nowhere else to go, she said. I could have stayed in Missouri. It would have been miserable, but I wouldn't have starved. I came because your letter was the first time in recent memory someone looked at what I could actually do and thought it was worth something. She paused. I'm not going to be sentimental about it, but I want you to know I made a choice, not a last resort. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his cup. Then he looked at her. That matters, he said. I know it does, she said. They drank their coffee. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the windows, dark and clean and enormous, and the fire in the stove ticked as the wood settled. And there was no fanfare about any of it, which was exactly right. They were married 10 days later in the front room of the ranch house, witnessed by Dunmore and a young ranch hand named Parrish, who looked like he might cry and was managing it with admirable restraint. Eli stood beside his father in a clean shirt and watched the proceedings with the solemn attention of someone who understood that something important was happening and hadn't yet decided how he felt about it. The minister was a compact, precise man who read the words without embellishment and shook both their hands afterward and wished them well without prying, which Eliza respected. Colton put a plain gold band on her finger. She had not expected this, and the unexpectedness of it, the small, deliberate gesture of it, moved something in her chest that she had not anticipated. My mother's, he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. If you'd rather have something new, I'll get you something new. She looked at the ring on her hand. No, she said, this is right. And she meant it, which was the part she hadn't expected. The settlement nearest to Hale Ranch was a modest cluster of buildings called Garnet Creek, a general store, a post office that also served as the telegraph office, a saloon, a small school that ran 3 days a week, and enough houses to constitute a community without quite constituting a town. The people who lived there and the surrounding homesteads were a particular kind of people, self-reliant in the way of necessity, deeply attentive to other people's business in the way of isolation, and possessed of the sharp evaluative instinct of those who have learned that misreading a stranger can cost you. They had heard about Colton Hale's new wife before she arrived in the territory. Frontier telegraph moved faster than the real kind. The woman who set the tone for how Garnet Creek received Eliza Mercer Hale was named Vera Calloway, and she had the particular power of a woman who has been in a place long enough to have an opinion on everything in it. She was not cruel in an obvious way. She was too intelligent for that. But she had the habit, common to people who are never publicly wrong, of delivering her judgments as observations. "She's from Missouri," Vera said, the first time Eliza came into the general store, 3 weeks after the wedding, to lay in winter supplies. She said it to the woman beside her in the way you might note a minor irregularity. Not an insult. An assessment with a tilt to it. Eliza was at the counter pricing flour when she heard it. She did not turn around. "Rancher Hale is a patient man," Vera continued. She lowered her voice in the way that people lower their voices when they want to be overheard. "I hope she's up to the country. A lot of them aren't." Eliza turned around. Not aggressively. She simply turned the way you turn when someone is speaking near you. "I'm Eliza Hale," she said pleasantly. "I don't believe we've met." Vera Calloway was 50 and broad-shouldered and had the look of someone who expected a blush. She did not get one. "Vera Calloway," she said, "my husband runs the livery." "Good to know," Eliza said. "We'll likely need the livery come winter. Nice to know who's running it." She smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, just the smile of a woman who has met 100 versions of this woman and knows exactly how to handle the species. Then she turned back to the counter and finished her order. It was not a victory. Not exactly. Vera Calloway was not the kind of woman who conceded victories. But something shifted in the store that day. Some small calibration of the social atmosphere, and the woman who had been standing next to Vera when she made her observations found an errand that required her to be at the other end of the store. Eliza drove the supply wagon home and did not mention the encounter to Colton. It was not worth mentioning. It was the kind of thing she'd been navigating her entire life. The particular assessment people made of a woman who didn't perform the right kind of smallness. And she had learned long ago that the best response to it was not defensiveness or confrontation, but simply existing in a way that made the assessment irrelevant over time. She had time. She intended to use it. What she had not anticipated was the particular texture of the loneliness. Not loneliness of isolation, not exactly. There was too much work and too much to think about for that kind of loneliness to get a real foothold. But there was a specific quiet in the evenings, after Eli was in bed when she and Colton sat in the same room, him reading or working through correspondence, her with her mending or her journal. And the silence was the silence of two people who had made a reasonable agreement and were honoring it, and who had not yet found the language to be anything more than reasonable to each other. He was not cold. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He was not cold, and he was not unkind, and he was not withholding in a mean way. He was simply sealed, like a door that had been closed from the inside and the person behind it had forgotten there were windows. She learned small things about him in the way you learn things about careful people, sideways, in glimpses. She learned that he had built the house himself, or most of it, in the 3 years before his first wife came to the ranch. She learned that he had grown up in Kansas, which explained a certain kind of flat, practical endurance she recognized. She learned that he was good with the horses in a way that went beyond management. The animals were calmer when he was in the yard, something the hands had noticed and mentioned without quite being able to explain. She learned that he had a temper he kept controlled in the way of someone who has spent years learning to control it. Not because it was gone, but because he had decided it had no useful place in the way he wanted to operate. She saw it once, briefly, when a neighboring rancher came by with a dispute about a fence line and was disrespectful in the careless way of a man who has decided the person across from him doesn't merit courtesy. Colton's voice didn't rise, but something behind his eyes changed, and the rancher, who was not a perceptive man, but was apparently capable of some basic animal self-preservation instinct, adjusted his posture and his tone. The dispute was resolved. The rancher left. Colton came back inside, and there was a tension in his jaw for 20 minutes that then gradually unwound, and he sat down and picked up what he'd been reading and did not mention it. She did not mention it either, but she filed it away. The temper, the control, and the fact that the control was a choice he made every time, rather than an absence of feeling. That was a meaningful distinction. She had known men whose control was real indifference, and she had known men whose control was a roof held down over something violent, and she had known men who simply contained feeling the way a keg contains pressure, and you did not handle those three types the same way. Colton was the keg type. The pressure wasn't dangerous. She had decided she believed that, but it was pressure, and it had been there a long time, and she could feel it in the house sometimes at night when she lay awake listening to the quiet. She knew, without being told, that it had to do with his first wife, with how she had died. She knew the shape of the wound without knowing its specifics, the way you can see the shape of something underwater without being able to read its detail. She did not ask. Not yet. There was an order to these things, even if no one had written it down. In the 4th week, Eli showed her his horses. He had 2 of them. Technically, 1 full horse and 1 pony that was officially a ranch animal, but which the boy had clearly annexed as his personal property. The pony was called Button, a name that had been given before Eli was old enough to name horses and had stuck in the way of all the names given before you know better. The other was a 3-year-old roan called Castor, who had been assigned to Eli's care as a teaching exercise by his father and whom Eli had developed the complicated feelings about that boys develop about animals that are both theirs and not theirs. He took her to the barn on a Sunday afternoon when the light was long and the work was light, with the particular air of a child who has decided to extend a privilege and wants it noted without being pointed. "This is Button," he said. The pony regarded her with the philosophical indifference of old animals. "He's seen a lot," she said. 11 years, Eli said with authority. "Papa says that's old for a pony but not for a horse. Papa doesn't explain why." "Different build," she said, running a hand along Button's neck. The pony leaned into it slightly, which was about as much emotional expressiveness as you could reasonably expect from a pony. More strain on the joints at the work they do. Same as people, different bodies wear differently. Eli filed this away with the particular expression of a child receiving information he will think about later in private. He showed her Castor. He showed her how he brushed the roan's coat, which he did with an earnestness that she found quietly moving. He told her about the time Castor had spooked at a jackrabbit and thrown him into the fence, described it with the precise detail of someone who has replayed the incident many times from multiple angles and has reached a complicated set of conclusions about both the horse's behavior and his own response to it. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, without any evident embarrassment about admitting it. "Did you get back on?" "Papa said I had to." "Was he right?" Eli considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said finally, "but I didn't like it at the time." "Most right things aren't likable at the time," she said. He looked at her. The wariness was still in his eyes, but something else had arrived alongside it. The tentative curiosity of someone who has decided to leave a door slightly open. "Do you ride?" he asked. "Not well," she said honestly. "Missouri girls don't have much occasion." "Papa could teach you." "Maybe," she said. "Or you could." He blinked. The idea of teaching an adult something appeared not to have occurred to him as a possibility. The expression that crossed his face was one she recognized. The specific, complicated pleasure of being considered useful by someone who didn't have to consider you useful. "I'm not as good as Papa," he said. "Good enough to start," she said. He thought about this for a long moment, turning it over. Then he put the brush down and straightened up with the dignity of a 7-year-old who has made a decision. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before chores." "Before chores," she agreed. She left the barn and walked back toward the house in the late afternoon, and the mountains were there like they always were. And the sky was that particular Wyoming blue that she was beginning to know by its variations. The morning blue, the noon blue, the evening blue that was closer to indigo and made everything under it look like it was being considered. And she thought about Colton, as she did more often than she let herself acknowledge, not romantically, or not only romantically, but with the steady, focused attention you give to a problem that matters. He was in there, behind that door, with whatever weight he had been carrying since his first wife died, and she was out here learning his son's horses and his ranch's soil and his household's rhythms. And they were circling each other in the polite, careful way of two people who have agreed to share something enormous and are still learning the shape of it. She did not expect it to be easy. She did not expect it to be quick. She expected it to be real, and she expected that real things, in her experience, were built slowly, out of small moments like horses in a barn and coffee in the morning, and honest answers to children's questions and a plain gold ring put on a finger without fanfare, and that this was not a lesser kind of building. It was, in fact, the only kind that held. She went inside. She started supper. The house filled with the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. And somewhere upstairs, Eli was probably arranging things into formations they were not meant for. And outside, the Wyoming evening was doing what Wyoming evenings did, going enormous and cold and indifferent and somehow inexplicably beautiful. She stood at the stove and stirred and thought, "Not definite," Eli had said. "Not definite yet." She looked around this kitchen, at the clean windows, at the reorganized shelf, at the account book she was going to suggest a better system for as soon as she figured out the right way to suggest it. Definite now, she thought. Definite enough. The first snow came in October, earlier than Dunmore said it usually did, which Dunmore noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been predicting bad things long enough that being right about them no longer surprises him. Eliza watched it come in from the kitchen window, a gray curtain dropping across the mountains first, then the foothills, then the ranch yard, filling the air with the particular silence that snow brings, the way it muffles the world and makes everything quieter than it has any right to be. She had known snow in Missouri. This was not that snow. This was snow with intentions. She had already spent 3 weeks preparing for it, which was why the root cellar was full. The woodpile was twice what it had been when she arrived. The kitchen garden had been properly mulched and put to rest, and the household stores were documented in the new ledger system she had finally, carefully, presented to Colton one evening with the explanation that the old system was accurate but difficult to use under pressure, and that pressure was exactly when you needed your numbers fast. He had looked at her reorganized system for a long time without speaking. "You've been sitting on this for a while," he said. "I didn't want to overstep." He looked up at her. "It's better than mine." "It borrows from yours," she said, which was true and also the diplomatic thing to say, and she had decided those two things did not have to be in conflict. He had nodded and started using the new system that same evening, and nothing more was said about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The snow settled in and the ranch contracted around itself the way ranches do in winter. The range work changing character, the days shorter, the world between the main house and the barn becoming a negotiation with the weather every morning. Colton was out less but harder at work when he was in, the winter bringing a different set of problems than the summer had. Eliza kept the household running with a steadiness that she did not perform and did not announce. It was simply there, like the woodpile, like the full root cellar, like the documented accounts. It was in November that Silas Crow came to call. She knew his name before she met him. She had heard it twice in Garnet Creek, once from the woman who ran the post office, who had mentioned it in passing with the careful neutrality of someone who has an opinion they are keeping close, and once from Dunmore, who had used it in the particular tone that men use when they are describing another man they do not trust but cannot openly accuse. He arrived on a Tuesday, when Colton was in the far pasture checking on a section of fence that the early snow had apparently compromised, and Eliza was in the front room with the account ledger and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. She heard the horse in the yard, heard the knock at the door, and went to answer it. Silas Crow was not what she expected, which she supposed was the point of him. He was well dressed for the territory, a good coat, clean boots, a hat that had not been bought at the Garnet Creek General Store. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, pleasant face and the kind of practiced warmth that takes years to perfect and is never entirely real. "Mrs. Hale," he said with a smile that showed the right amount of teeth. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Silas Crow. I have some business with your husband." "He's not in," she said. "I don't mind waiting if that's convenient." She looked at him. She had met men like this before. Not exactly like this. The frontier version was its own particular species, but the fundamental type. The man whose pleasantness is a tool he keeps very sharp and uses very carefully. Her father had owed money to a man like this once. She had watched that play out. "Come in," she said, because refusing would be rude, and rudeness was not a card she was going to play yet. "I'll get coffee." She put him in the front room and went to the kitchen, and while she was making coffee, she was thinking, and what she was thinking was, why is he here on a day when he likely knew Colton was out in the far pasture? Ranches talked. Garnet Creek talked. A man with Crow's kind of practiced social intelligence would know the ranch's daily patterns within a week of deciding to take an interest in it. She came back with the coffee and sat across from him and let him talk. He was smooth about it. He spoke about the territory, about the cattle market, about the difficulty of running a large operation in a hard winter. He mentioned with well-manufactured casualness that he had been in land acquisition for going on 15 years and that the territory was changing, that the old way of holding large unfenced ranges was becoming difficult, that a man in Colton's position might want to think carefully about the future of his operation. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. He looked at her with the slight recalibration of a man who had expected polite listening and gotten a direct question. "Just a conversation," he said. "There are parties interested in some of the Hale Range that borders the creek. A fair price. Nothing that would compromise the core operation." "Which parties?" "Investment interests from back east, primarily." "What are their names?" A pause. Very brief, very controlled. "I'd want to discuss the specifics with Mr. Hale directly." "Of course," she said pleasantly. "When he's available." She picked up her coffee. "Can I ask how long you've been looking at this particular property?" "I've had a general interest in the territory for some time." "How specific is your general interest?" she asked. "For instance, have you spoken with anyone at the land office about the Hale Creek boundary parcels?" He looked at her for a moment. The pleasantness held, but something behind it shifted, like furniture moving in a room where you can't quite see. "You're well informed for someone who arrived." He stopped himself. "For someone who arrived when?" she asked. He set his cup down. He smiled again, but it was a different smile, smaller, something closer to genuine. "You're a careful woman, Mrs. Hale." "I keep the accounts," she said. "Careful is the requirement." Colton came home an hour later to find Eliza at the kitchen table with her journal open, writing in the shorthand she used for things she wanted to think through in detail. She told him about the visit without editorializing. Who, what was said, what wasn't said, her reading of what he actually wanted. Colton listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands flat on the table. "He's been circling for 2 years," he said. "What does he actually want?" "The creek boundary parcels, like he said, but the creek parcels aren't valuable by themselves. They're the leverage point on the water rights. You control that section, you control where the main herd can water in summer." He paused. "He knows that." "He knows you know that," Eliza said. "He came when you were out." Colton looked at her. He wanted to get a sense of what he was dealing with on this end before he made a serious offer, she said. He wasn't expecting. She gestured at herself with a slight motion that managed to be neither modest nor immodest, just accurate. Something moved in Colton's face. Not quite a smile, but near it. "No," he said. "He wasn't expecting you." She tapped her journal. "I want to pull the land records on those boundary parcels. I want to know exactly what the legal ground looks like before he comes back." "He'll come back when I'm here." "He'll come back when you're here," she agreed. "But I want to know the numbers before that conversation happens." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The land records are in the locked box in the desk. I'll get you the key." Crow came back 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, when Colton was very much present. Eliza was also present, which seemed to mildly surprise Crow, though he was too practiced to let it show much. She sat at the far end of the table with a cup of tea and her expression arranged in the pleasant, attentive manner of a woman who is simply there while the men talk. She was not simply there. She had spent 3 days with those land records. She knew the creek boundary parcels better than she suspected Crow did. She knew that one of the parcels had a surveying irregularity from 8 years prior that had never been formally resolved, which meant any purchase offer on that parcel would rest on contested ground until the irregularity was addressed, a process that would cost time and money, and that a careful buyer would want resolved before, not after, completing any transaction. She let Crow make his offer. It was generous on the surface. the kind of number designed to seem obviously reasonable. She watched Colton's face stay still. "I'd want to look at the survey records before I considered any part of the creek boundary," Colton said. Crow's expression flickered very briefly. "Standard surveys, nothing complicated." "The 1871 survey on the north parcel has a chain discrepancy," Eliza said, without looking up from her tea. "About 40 feet along the eastern edge. It's in the original filing, never corrected." Silence in the room. Crow turned to look at her. This time, the pleasantness took a full second to reassemble. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "you've done your research." "I keep the accounts," she said again, pleasantly. "It's the same work." It was not the same work. They all three knew it was not the same work. But she said it pleasantly enough that Crow had no clean way to challenge it without being visibly unpleasant, which was not the posture he wanted to take in a room where the person he needed to negotiate with was watching closely. The meeting ended without an agreement, which was the intended outcome. Crow left with his pleasant face and his good coat, and Eliza heard his horse leave the yard, and the front room was quiet. Colton was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was something close to wonder, the particular wonder of watching someone do something you didn't know they could do and realizing you had not in fact been paying full attention. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. 4 years of keeping accounts for people who didn't pay attention," she said. "You learn to know the numbers better than everyone in the room. It's the only power that's actually yours." He was quiet. Then he said, "Thank you." She nodded. She picked up her tea. She went to the kitchen to start supper, and if her hands were slightly unsteady as she reached for the pot, it was because the adrenaline of the last hour had somewhere to go, and it chose her hands to go there. And she gripped the pot handle and let the steadiness come back before she started anything that required careful measurement. The blizzard arrived in the second week of December with the kind of announcement that made preparation feel theoretical. She had read about blizzards. She had spoken to Dunmore about them. She had taken the precautions that could be taken. Extra firewood stacked inside the house, extra stores in the kitchen, the livestock secured the evening before when the sky went the particular yellow-green that Dunmore said meant serious weather coming. She had done everything right by the available information. None of that meant she was ready for the sound of it. It came in the night, first as wind and then as something that went beyond wind into a different category, a sustained battering that made the house walls flex slightly, that drove snow in horizontal sheets past the windows, that reduced the world outside to a gray-white nothing. By morning, the drifts were up to the first windowsills on the windward side of the house. The barn was invisible. They were not going anywhere. Eli, at first, treated this as an adventure. He pressed his face against the window and watched the storm with wide eyes, and made inventories of their food stores with a seriousness that was mostly theatrical but contained some genuine practical thinking, which Eliza noted with approval. He helped her carry extra wood from the stack inside the back door. He asked questions about blizzards with the enthusiasm of a child who has encountered something bigger than he expected and is deciding whether to be frightened or fascinated. "How long does it last?" he asked. "Depends," she said. "This one looks serious. Could be 2 days, could be more." "What do we do?" "Stay warm. Keep the animals checked. Don't go out without a rope." "What's the rope for?" "So you can find your way back," she said. "When it's like this, you can't see your hand in front of your face. People get turned around 10 feet from their own door." He absorbed this. "Has that happened?" "To others. Won't happen to us because we're going to be careful." She looked at him. "Right?" "Right," he said, with the grave responsibility of a child who has been enlisted in something real. Colton was the one who was not all right. She noticed it the first evening, a quality to his stillness that was different from his usual stillness, tighter, with something behind it that she recognized by now as the pressure inside the sealed door pressing outward. He sat by the fire and was functional. He answered when spoken to, he ate, he checked the fire. But he was somewhere else. Some internal terrain she could feel him navigating. She said nothing that first evening. She put Eli to bed and came back downstairs and sat with her mending and let the silence be what it was. The second day, the storm did not let up. Colton was worse by afternoon. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way he checked the window more than was necessary, in the slight roughness that came into his voice when Eli asked a question he had to pull himself back to answer. She had been watching this man for 3 months now, watching with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered, and she knew the difference between his difficult moods and something that was costing him real currency. She made coffee. She brought a cup to where he stood at the window, watching nothing but snow. He took the cup. He didn't turn. "Tell me," she said. "Nothing to tell." "Colton." He was quiet a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to speak. Then he said, without turning from the window, "Clara died in a storm. Not like this one. March storm. She went out to check on one of the horses, and she went the wrong way in the dark and the cold." His voice was flat and even in the way that voices go flat, and even when the feeling behind them is too large for tone to carry. They found her the next morning, 40 feet from the barn door. The fire ticked in the grate. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the glass. Eliza stood with her own cup and looked at the side of his face and thought about 40 feet. She thought about a woman she had never known, whose ring was on her finger right now, who had walked 40 feet in the wrong direction and not come back. She thought about a man who had built this house and this ranch and was standing at a window in a blizzard 3 years later, still carrying that 40 feet around with him everywhere he went. "You couldn't have stopped it," she said. "I should have checked the horse myself." "Maybe, but you didn't know." "I should have known," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath the 3 years of even tone and sealed doors. "I knew that horse was nervous. I knew the weather was turning. I should have—" "Colton." She put her hand on his arm. Not softly, not as comfort exactly, firmly, the way you touch something you need to hold steady. "You have been carrying a verdict against yourself for 3 years for something you didn't choose. That is not guilt. That is punishment." He turned then. He looked at her with the raw expression of a man whose door has just come off its hinges when he wasn't prepared for it. "There's a difference," she said. "Guilt is about what happened. Punishment is what you do to yourself after. She would not have wanted you. You didn't know her." "No," Eliza said, "but I know you. And I know you are a man who, if you made a genuine mistake, would find a way to carry it and move forward because that is how you're built. What you're doing is not that. What you're doing is holding yourself responsible for weather and bad luck and the particular terrible randomness of how things go wrong." She paused. "And it is eating you alive. It is eating this house alive." He looked at her for a long time. His jaw was tight. His eyes were very bright in the firelight. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 months, she said honestly. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it wasn't time," she said. "It took a blizzard. He made a sound, not a laugh, not a cry, something in between the two that had been waiting a long time for permission to exist." He turned back to the window, but differently now, and she stayed where she was with her hand on his arm, and the storm pressed on, and the house held. It was a long night. They sat by the fire after Eli was in bed, and he talked in the way that people talk when they have been silent for a very long time. Not always coherently, not always in the right order, circling back to certain things and then away from them. He talked about Clara, who had been funny and sharp and not afraid of anything, who had loved the ranch in a way that was different from his own love for it, his love being about the building of it, hers being about the living in it. He talked about the year after she died, which he described in terms so stripped of sentiment that the bleakness of it came through precisely because he wasn't trying to make it sound bleak. He talked about Eli, about the boy's face when he was told, about trying to explain to a 4-year-old what gone meant when gone meant forever. Eliza listened. She asked questions when a question was better than silence, and was quiet when silence was better than a question. She did not tell him it would be all right. She did not tell him the grief would pass. She knew better than to say things that were true in general terms, but useless in specific ones. What she said, when he finally stopped talking and the fire had burned down and the blizzard was still making its argument against the walls, was this: "She loved you well enough that losing her nearly destroyed you. That is not a small thing. That is not something to be ashamed of. The shame only comes in if you let it keep you dead while you're still here." He was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. "You are not what I expected," he said, for the 3rd or 4th time. But this time it meant something different than it had the times before. "You keep saying that," she said. "It keeps being true," he said. She looked at him. This man with his sealed-up grief and his good jaw and his careful hands and his 7-year-old boy asleep upstairs. And something in her chest did the particular thing it had been threatening to do for 3 months. The thing she had been managing and cataloging and keeping at a careful professional distance from, and she let it do it. "Colton," she said. "Yeah, I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had not quite let himself look at her in 3 months of careful, reasonable partnership. "I know," he said. "I think I knew that before you did." She thought about arguing this. She decided not to. Outside, the blizzard was beginning, very slowly, to spend itself. The sound of it was changing, still enormous, but with less fury in it, more persistence than attack. The fire needed another log, and she got up and put one on and stood for a moment with the warmth of it against her face. When she turned back, Colton was still looking at her, not with the sealed expression, with the actual one. "Thank you," he said, "for—" He gestured, and the gesture encompassed the room, the accounts, the conversation with Crow, the blizzard, the long night, everything that could not be precisely named. She sat back down. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "It's just what it is." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a declaration, just as a fact. His hand was rough and warm and entirely steady. They sat like that while the fire burned and the storm finished its business with the world outside, and the house was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before, not the quiet of maintenance, not the quiet of two people keeping a careful distance, but the quiet of two people who have stopped pretending the distance is what either of them wanted. It was not perfect. Nothing about it was perfect. They were two imperfect people in a difficult place with a complicated past and an uncertain future, and a boy upstairs who was still watching to see if the door would stay open. But it was real. And Eliza, who had made a study of the difference between things that looked real and things that were, knew which one she was holding. She looked at the ring on her finger, the plain gold band that had been his mother's, that he had put on her hand in a front room with 2 witnesses and a boy in a clean shirt. And she thought, this is the thing that holds, not the easy parts, not the smooth parts. This, the storm and the fire, and the telling the truth in the dark. Outside, the last of the blizzard moved on through. The silence it left behind was the kind that feels earned. The morning after the blizzard broke, Eliza woke before anyone else and stood at the east window of their room, a word she was still learning to use without the slight internal pause, and looked out at what the storm had left behind. It was extraordinary. She would give the territory that. Whatever Wyoming decided to do, it did without half measures. The ranch yard had been remade overnight into something that looked less like a working cattle operation and more like a landscape painting done by someone who had strong opinions about white. The drifts were 4 feet in places, 5 near the barn wall, sculpted by the wind into shapes that had no practical purpose and considerable accidental beauty. The sky above it was the particular hard blue that came after serious weather, the kind of blue that looked like it had been scoured clean from the inside. She dressed and went downstairs and made coffee and stood with it at the kitchen window, and she let herself feel, quietly and without performance, the specific quality of this morning as distinct from every other morning since she'd arrived. Something had changed in the house. Not dramatically, nothing broke open, no declarations were made, no great shift announced itself. But the sealed quality was gone. The door that had been closed from the inside was open now, not flung wide, but open. The way doors open when someone decides to leave them that way, rather than letting them swing shut by habit. Colton came downstairs and found her at the window and came to stand beside her with his own cup, and they stood together and looked at the buried yard, and he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just for a moment, just as a fact. And then they both went about the business of digging out, because the ranch did not stop needing attention because the people running it had experienced something important the night before. That was the difference, she thought, loading wood onto the porch. That was the specific difference between this life and the one she'd left. This life did not wait for you to be ready. The weeks that followed the blizzard had a different texture than the weeks before it. Not easier, necessarily. Winter on a Wyoming cattle ranch had its own relentless logic, and January came in harder than December had ended, with cold that settled into the bones of the buildings and required constant management. But the house had warmth in it now that was not just the wood stove. Colton talked more. Not effusively, he was not built for that, but genuinely, in the way of a man who has remembered that speaking is not the same as being vulnerable. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions and listened when she gave it, and disagreed when he disagreed, and they worked through those disagreements at the kitchen table in the evenings with the account books between them and coffee going cold. Eli noticed. He noticed in the way children notice things, not all at once, not with analysis, but in behavioral adjustment, in the slow relaxation of something he'd been holding. He started leaving his bedroom door open at night, which he had not done before. He started showing her things without the deliberate casualness of someone extending a privilege. Just showing her things, the way you show things to people who are simply there. He brought her a bird's nest he found in the collapsed section of fence and put it on the kitchen table like it was a thing she would want to see, which she did. "It's an early nest," she said, turning it over in her hands. "They build in spring. This one's from last year." "How do you know?" "The material. Fresh nests have more green in them. This is all dried." She set it down. "The bird that built this is probably somewhere warm right now." Eli looked at the nest. "Wish I was somewhere warm." "You are somewhere warm," she said. "You're in the kitchen." He gave her the look that children reserve for adults who are being technically correct in annoying ways. It was, she thought, the most naturally he'd ever looked at her. Like she was just a person, like she had become, without either of them marking the exact moment, familiar. She didn't ruin it by acknowledging it. She handed the nest back and went to the stove, and he took it upstairs to add to the collection of objects on his windowsill that told the story of a boy learning his piece of the world. The land deal came together in February, and it came together because of Eliza. She had spent 6 weeks since Crow's last visit working through every angle of the water rights question. Not just the legal records, which she'd already read 3 times, but the practical reality of what those creek boundary parcels meant to the operation. She had talked to Dunmore at length about where the herd watered in summer, which sections they used most heavily. What would happen to their summer range if the creek access was constrained? She had written 2 letters to a land attorney in Cheyenne, whose name she'd found on a document in the bottom of the locked box. Letters she'd shown Colton before sending and which he'd read carefully and handed back, saying, "Send them." The attorney's name was Morton Geddes, and he turned out to be a precise, thorough man who appreciated precise, thorough correspondence. He wrote back with detailed assessments of the boundary parcel survey question, and his assessment confirmed what Eliza had suspected. The 1871 chain discrepancy was real and correctable, but it needed to be resolved by a formal resurvey before the parcels could be cleanly sold or transferred. Any sale conducted before that resolution would be contestable. This was, Geddes noted in his careful attorney language, a significant leverage point in any negotiation. Eliza had read that letter 4 times and then sat down and drafted the strategy she presented to Colton on a Sunday evening in early February with the snow still heavy on the ground and the fire well stoked and Eli in bed. "Crow wants the parcels," she said, "because they're the water rights leverage, but he can't take clean possession without the resurvey. We can use that." Colton was reading through her notes, which she had organized in the clear, categorical way she organized everything. "You want to offer him a counter." "I want to offer him a choice," she said. "He can wait for us to resolve the survey, on our timeline, and then negotiate a proper price with full legal standing. Or we can negotiate a long-term water access agreement that gives his grazing operations what he actually needs without transferring the underlying land." Colton looked up. "He won't want a lease. He wants ownership." "He wants what ownership gives him," she said. "That's the water access in summer. A properly structured lease gives him that, and it gives us an income stream and retained ownership of the parcels." She paused. "The question is whether he's patient enough to negotiate seriously, or whether he'll try to push." "He'll try to push first," Colton said without hesitation. "Yes," she agreed. "So we need to be ready for the push." The meeting happened on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February. Crow came with another man this time, a broader, quieter man he introduced as an associate, whose function appeared to be to make the room feel more occupied on Crow's side of the equation. Eliza noted this as a tactic and adjusted accordingly. She was also present, seated at the table with a leather folder of documents that was not theatrical but was visible. Crow opened with the same offer he'd made before, dressed in slightly different language. Colton said he'd given the matter consideration and had concerns about the survey irregularity that made him reluctant to proceed. Crow said the irregularity was minor and easily addressed. Eliza said pleasantly that the attorney in Cheyenne did not consider it minor and that his written assessment was available for review if Mr. Crow would like to see it. There was a silence. Crow looked at the leather folder. Then he said, with a smile that was doing some visible labor, "I wasn't aware you'd engaged an attorney." "We engage an attorney for anything involving land transfer," Eliza said. "It seems like the sensible practice." Crow's associate shifted his weight. The push came 15 minutes later when Crow abandoned the pleasant approach and went direct. The offer on the table was fair, the survey issue was manageable, time was of value to both parties, and a prompt decision would be in everyone's interest. Colton looked at Eliza. It was a small look, quick, entirely private. The look of a man checking in with his partner, not asking permission, checking in, confirming they were reading the room the same way. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned back to Crow and said, in the even voice he used when he had made a decision and was finished negotiating it internally, "We're not selling the parcels. What we're prepared to discuss is a long-term water access agreement, 15 years with renewal options structured around the summer grazing calendar. Our attorney has drafted terms. If that interests you, we can proceed. If it doesn't, that's your right, but we won't be revisiting the sale." Crow looked at him, looked at Eliza, looked at the leather folder. He was, she could see, doing the calculation. He had expected to be dealing with a grieving widower who needed money and was distracted by his own unfinished business. He had not expected Colton Hale to show up to this negotiation with his accounts organized and his survey question documented and his position clear, and a wife who had apparently spent 2 months becoming conversant in Wyoming water law. "I'd want to review the terms," he said finally. "Of course," Eliza said, and took the relevant pages from the folder and slid them across the table with the precision of someone who has had them ready since before Crow arrived. He left without signing anything, which was expected. He came back 2 weeks later with a counteroffer that was, Getty's confirmed in his next letter, essentially a version of their terms with minor modifications that were negotiable. The agreement was signed in March, witnessed by Getty's and Dunmore, and it gave Hale Ranch a 15-year income stream and retained ownership of the water right parcels that Crow had spent the better part of 2 years trying to acquire. Colton rolled the signed documents and put them in the locked box and sat at the kitchen table for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "He never saw it coming." "He underestimated the accounting," Eliza said. Colton shook his head slowly. "He underestimated you." He looked at her. "I don't think anyone's going to keep making that mistake." She thought about that, about Vera Calloway at the general store with her tilted observations, about her sisters sending her name as a joke, about the particular long history of being the person in the room that no one was watching. "Some of them will," she said. "It's useful when they do." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not the precursor to one, not the shadow of the idea. A full, honest sound that filled the kitchen in a way that clearly surprised him as much as it surprised her, like a muscle used after a long time of not being used, finding it still worked. It was the first time she had heard him actually laugh, and it was, she thought, one of the better sounds she had encountered in 22 years of living. The news of the agreement spread through Garnet Creek in the way that all news spread through Garnet Creek, quickly, imprecisely, and with editorial enhancement. What reached Eliza in the general store 3 weeks later was a version of events that was broadly accurate in its facts and somewhat confused in its attribution. Several people having concluded that Colton had found himself a very sharp attorney without quite grasping that the sharp part had been sitting at his kitchen table since October. She let this stand. She had no interest in correcting it. The outcome was what mattered, not the credit, and she had never in her life done useful things in order to be seen doing them. What she had not entirely anticipated was Vera Calloway. The woman was at the general store counter when Eliza came in for supplies on a Tuesday morning in late March. There was a moment, brief, the length of a breath, where they looked at each other across the store in the way of two people who have been circling an honest conversation for months. Then Vera Calloway said, in a voice that had lost most of its careful tilt, "I hear you held Silas Crow off the creek parcels." "We came to an agreement that worked for the ranch," Eliza said. Vera looked at her for a long moment. The assessment in her eyes was different this time. less evaluative, more something that resembled reluctant recalibration. Silas Crow has been trying to acquire pieces of this county for 10 years, Vera said. He got 3 parcels off the Hannigan family last year after their oldest boy took sick and they needed cash. Paid half market rate. She paused. Most people can't negotiate with him. He's patient, and he doesn't look like what he is. He's exactly what he looks like, Eliza said. If you're looking at his hands instead of his face. Vera Calloway considered this. Then she said something that Eliza suspected cost her some genuine internal effort. I misjudged you when you came. Eliza set her list on the counter. People usually do, she said, without heat. I've mostly stopped minding. It was not a friendship, not then, but it was an acknowledgement, and in a small community built on the currency of opinion, an acknowledgement from Vera Calloway was worth considerably more than it had any right to be. By April, when Eliza went to town, people spoke to her differently. Not with warmth, not all of them, but with the specific respect reserved for someone who has demonstrated competence in a context that required it. The ranch hands had felt this shift earlier. Dunmore had been her steady advocate since the garden incident, but the others had come around in their own time and in their own order, persuaded less by anything she said and more by the simple ongoing evidence of what happened when she was on top of something. She did not take any of it as settled. She had seen enough of how quickly opinion moved to know better. Spring came in late in Wyoming, arrived without apology or announcement sometime in April, the snow retreating gradually from the lower elevations while holding on above, the ground asserting itself in patches of wet brown that became green over the course of 2 slow weeks. The kitchen garden, which she had mulched and amended and prepared through the fall, came up with considerably more determination than it had shown the previous summer. She found Eli crouched at the garden edge one morning, watching a row of early shoots with the focused attention of someone monitoring a situation. Are they doing it right? She asked, crouching beside him. They're crooked, he said, concerned. They'll straighten when they have more sun. They're reaching for it. He looked at the shoots, then at the sky, then at the shoots again. That's what you do when something's hard to get, he said. You just keep going toward it. She looked at the side of his face, this boy who was 8 years old now. He had turned 8 in January, and she had made him a cake that had not been entirely level, but had been genuinely good. And he had eaten 2 pieces and been matter-of-fact about the third. And she thought, he is going to be all right. He has the equipment for it. Yes, she said. That's exactly what you do. He stood up and went to get his jacket for school, and she stayed crouched at the garden for another moment and put her hand in the soil that was softer now, more giving, and she thought about the day she'd arrived and knelt in this same garden and felt what it needed. She had fixed it. It had taken months, but she had fixed it. Not everything could be fixed. She was not naive about that. The grief in this house was not fixed. It was better. It was managed. It had been named and looked at and integrated rather than sealed off. But Clara was still gone and would always be gone, and that was a real thing that had not changed. The distance between herself and Colton was not fully closed. There were still evenings when he retreated somewhere she couldn't follow, and she had the sense to let him. And there were still things he carried that she could feel but couldn't reach. They were 2 people who had come to each other sideways and were still learning the language of it. But the house had music in it now. That was the most concrete change, and she had not manufactured it or planned it. It had happened in February, on a Sunday evening when there was nothing requiring urgent attention, and Eli had found, in the back of the chest in the sitting room, a fiddle that had been put away at some point and not taken out again. He had brought it to Eliza with the question of what it was, and she had taken it and looked it over and found it was still in reasonable condition. And then she had played it, badly at first and then less badly. The muscle memory of a thing she had learned at 12 years old coming back in fragments that gradually assembled themselves. Eli had stared at her. You play? I used to, she said. I'm out of practice. She played anyway. A simple thing. A song she'd known since childhood, not performed well. There were missed notes, and one section she had to stop and restart, but played honestly, which was better than performed well. Colton had stood in the doorway of the sitting room, and she hadn't seen him there until she finished and looked up and found him watching with that expression she had come to recognize. The one that meant something was reaching him past the wall he kept up. He didn't say anything, but the next evening he had brought the fiddle down from where Eli had left it on the shelf. and he had oiled it properly and replaced a string that was failing, and he had set it in the sitting room rather than putting it back in the chest. It stayed there. She played it in the evening sometimes. Not every evening, not as a routine exactly, but as a presence. Sound coming into a house that had been too quiet for too long. Eli had decided he wanted to learn, which was an enterprise of considerable patience on both their parts and remarkable determination on his, and the sounds he produced in his practice sessions were genuinely alarming. But there was something in his face while he was doing it that she would not have traded for anything. There was one evening in late April. Eli had gone to bed. Colton had come in from the last rounds. They were at the kitchen table with the evening quiet around them. When Colton reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, without preamble, "I'm glad you came," she turned her hand over under his. "So am I," she said. It was not the most eloquent exchange. It did not need to be. It was two people saying a real thing directly, which was the language they had built between them, and it was sufficient. What she said next, she said because she had been carrying it, and because the particular quiet of that evening made it the right time. "I'm going to have a baby." The kitchen was very still. She watched his face, watched the sequence of things that moved through it. First, the plain surprise of it. Then something that went deeper than surprise, something she had to read carefully because it was complicated. She could see the happiness in it, genuine happiness. And she could also see the fear arriving alongside the happiness the way it always did for him now when something mattered, the fear that things that matter get taken. His hand tightened on hers. "Eliza," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. She did know. She knew what he was feeling without him having to construct it into sentences. He said after a moment, in a voice that was careful and deliberate and costing him something to keep level, "Are you—" "I'm well," she said. "I've been well. I'll stay well." She looked at him steadily. "I am not Clara. I am not going to be taken from you the same way. I know you can't be certain of that. I know the fear is not something I can simply talk you out of." She paused. "But I need you to hear me when I say I'm going to be all right. I intend to be. And I need you to hold on to that alongside the fear instead of letting the fear take the whole room." He looked at her for a long time. His eyes were very bright. "I hear you," he said. "Good," she said. His thumb moved over her hand back and forth once, twice. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the April night was cold but not bitter, the worst of the winter finally behind them. "Eli's going to be something about this," Colton said after a while. And the way he said it, the slight note in his voice, the almost lightness of it, told her that he was choosing, deliberately and with effort, to let the happiness occupy the space alongside the fear rather than be crowded out by it. "He's going to have opinions," she agreed. "He always has opinions. He comes by it honestly," she said. This time Colton's mouth moved into the full smile, the real one that she had been seeing more of since December, the one that changed his whole face into something that was almost boyish and entirely genuine. "That," he said, "is not entirely my fault." She laughed. He laughed. The sound of it went up into the rafters of the kitchen, and the house held it, and outside the Wyoming night did what Wyoming nights did, went on enormous and cold and ancient and entirely unimpressed. And inside the lamp burned, and the fire was warm, and the fiddle sat on its shelf in the sitting room waiting for tomorrow. This was not a perfect life. She knew that, and she did not want a perfect life. She had enough sense to know that perfect things were brittle, that they had no tensile strength, that they shattered the first time real weight was put on them. What this was real. What this was hers, built out of a cruel joke and a letter, and a long train ride and 3 months of careful, honest work, and a blizzard, and a land deal, and a boy learning the violin badly, and a man learning, slowly and imperfectly, to keep a door open. She looked around this kitchen, at the clean windows and the organized shelves, and the ledger on the desk, and the fiddle on the shelf visible through the doorway. And she thought of the farm in Missouri, of the account books that no one thanked her for, of the sister who had written her name as a punchline on a piece of paper and sent it into the world without expecting anything to come of it. Something had come of it. Something she could not have planned and would not trade, hard parts included, for anything the forgettable Missouri life could have offered her. She was 22 years old, and she had become, without intending to and without ceremony, exactly who she was. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Summer came to Wyoming the way it always did, without asking permission, arriving fully formed one morning as though it had been there all along and you had simply failed to notice. The snow retreated to the highest elevations and stayed there, a white edge against the blue, and the ranch opened up again the way a fist opens, gradual, and then all at once. Eliza was 7 months along by June, which was a fact that the territory made no accommodations for, and which she had not expected accommodations for. She moved differently, carefully, with the deliberate awareness of someone carrying something irreplaceable. But she moved. She kept the accounts. She managed the household. She made the ride to Garnet Creek in the wagon once a week with Eli beside her on the bench seat, which was his self-appointed position since February, when he had processed the news about the baby through 3 days of unusual quiet and emerged from it having apparently decided that the correct response was vigilance. He was vigilant. He was 8 years old and entirely serious about it. "You shouldn't carry that," he told her one morning when she lifted a crate of preserving jars from the pantry shelf. "It's not heavy," she said. "Papa said—" "Your father said I should be careful, not that I should stop using my arms." She set the crate down on the counter. "There's a difference. Come help me with these instead of watching me carry them." He came and helped with the jars, grumbling in the way he had inherited from his father, not loudly, not dramatically, just a low current of discontent that he felt was being registered in the official record, even if no one was acting on it. She had learned, across 8 months of knowing this boy, that the grumbling meant he was invested. Eli Hale did not bother to grumble about things he didn't care about. Colton was the harder case. She had told him the truth in April, that she needed him to hold the fear alongside the happiness rather than letting it take the whole room. And he was doing it, which she respected, because she knew what it cost him. She could see the cost sometimes. On the days when she was tired and moved slowly, on the evenings when she mentioned something uncomfortable about the pregnancy, she would watch him go still in that particular way and then deliberately, visibly, bring himself back. It was not graceful. It was not the behavior of a man who had resolved his fear and moved beyond it. It was the behavior of a man who was afraid and had decided that the fear was not going to run his life anymore. And those were not the same thing. And the second one was considerably harder and considerably more honest. She loved him for it. She had been loving him for it for months without quite having used that word in her own mind, and she used it now, in June, standing at the kitchen window with her hands on the window frame and the summer morning opening up across the ranch yard, and she let it be the plain, undecorated thing it was. She loved him. He was difficult and sealed and imperfect and carrying damage from his life the way everyone was carrying damage from theirs, and she loved him. She had not come here for love. She had come here for something honest, which it turned out was the same direction. The letter from Missouri arrived on a Tuesday in the middle of June, which was when the summer work was thickest and Eliza had the least patience for complications. She recognized Arabella's handwriting on the envelope. She stood at the mail table in the post office in Garnet Creek for a moment, holding it, and thought about not opening it. She opened it. Arabella wrote that she and Josephine had been thinking about Eliza. She wrote that their mother had been unwell through the winter, nothing serious, but enough to make them aware of time passing. She wrote, in the careful language of a woman constructing a sentence that requires more courage than it looks like it does, that they had heard things, from people who had corresponded with people in the territory, the way news moved, that suggested Eliza had made a place for herself out there. She wrote that they would like to visit, if such a visit was welcome. She did not apologize. She came close to it. There was a sentence in the middle of the letter that started, "I know that what Josephine and I did was," and then said not what it should have been, which was the apology of someone who could not quite bring themselves to use the direct language. Eliza read this sentence 3 times. She wrote back that same evening. She wrote that a visit was acceptable, that she would expect them in September when the worst of the summer work was finished. She wrote that they were welcome in her home, that she would treat them as guests, and that she hoped they understood she had not remained in Wyoming simply because she had nowhere else to go. She did not write more than that. She had things to say, certainly, things she had been saying in her head for a year, arguments she had constructed in the dark of early mornings with precision and some real heat. But she had learned, the way you learn things that cost you something, the difference between things that needed to be said and things that simply needed to be released. The visit would be the conversation. The letter was the door. She told Colton about it that evening. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than feeling. Then he said, "You want them to come." It was not quite a question. He was reading her the way he had gotten better at reading her. "I want them to see," she said. "There's a difference." He considered this. "Fair enough," he said. "Your family is welcome here." She looked at him. "You might not like Josephine." "I already don't like what she did." "She's more complicated than what she did," Eliza said. "Most people are." He gave her a long look. "You're more generous than I would be." "Probably," she said. "But I spent a year figuring out who I am in this place, and it turned out to be someone who doesn't need to carry old scores. That surprised me." She picked up her tea. "Josephine did a cruel thing. She also, in the specific roundabout way of cruel things done by people who don't think them through, sent me somewhere I belonged. I don't know what to do with that except acknowledge it's complicated." Colton was quiet. Then, "You're a hard woman to stay angry with." "I know," she said. "It's a flaw." She was delivered of a daughter on the 14th of August in the hard, bright heat of a Wyoming summer afternoon, in the bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall with the east window open and the mountains visible from the bed. It was not easy. She would not have anyone pretend it was easy. Labor was the specific particular work of women that no one found adequate language for. Not the language of heroism, which was too grand, and not the language of suffering, which missed the purposefulness of it. It was hard work done under pressure with a clear objective, which was the most honest description she could manage, and she held on to that description during the parts of it that required holding on to something. The doctor from Garnet Creek, a compact, capable woman named Dr. Frances Oakes, who had been practicing in the territory for 12 years, and who had delivered approximately 400 babies with the methodical competence of someone who has done something enough times to have seen almost every variation, was present and in charge, which was exactly how Eliza wanted it. Colton was downstairs. She had told him to stay downstairs. He had not wanted to stay downstairs, but he had stayed, which was about the best you could ask of him on the worst afternoon of his particular variety of fear. Eli was at Dunmore's house, which Dunmore had offered with the quiet understanding of a man who had been on this ranch for 7 years and knew what this day was going to cost everyone. When it was done, when the baby was there, alive, loud, furious at the world in the specific way of the newly arrived, Dr. Oakes cleaned her up and wrapped her and put her in Eliza's arms. And Eliza looked at this small, outraged person and felt something she would have been embarrassed to describe aloud, because she was not generally a person given to the unguarded variety of feeling. She was not embarrassed. She looked at her daughter and she felt it fully, and she did not manage or catalog or keep at a professional distance. She just felt it. "Colton," she called. He was up the stairs before she'd finished saying his name. She heard the footsteps on the stairs, the pause at the door, and then he was in the doorway, and she watched his face do what it did when he came through a door and found her there. The brief, involuntary relief of a man who has been afraid and found the thing he was afraid of losing still present. Then he saw the baby, and his face did something different. It broke. Not in the way of breaking down, not weeping, not falling apart, nothing so theatrical, but in the way of something that has been held at a certain tension for a long time finally releasing, like a rope unknotting, like a window opened after a winter. He came to the bed and she held the baby up, and he took her, not confidently at first. His hands were careful in the way of someone afraid of breaking something, and then more steadily as the baby settled against his chest with the pragmatic comfort of a small person who has decided this will do. He looked at his daughter for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Eliza, and what was in his eyes she had no name for except that it was real, and it was his, and it was entirely without performance. "She's all right," he said, which was not about the baby. "She's all right," Eliza confirmed, which was also not entirely about the baby. "We both are." He sat on the edge of the bed with the baby in his arms, and Dr. Oakes gathered her things with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned how to leave a room when a room needs to be a room. And the August afternoon came through the east window with the mountains behind it, and the three of them were there. The fear was not gone. She could feel that it was not entirely gone. It was too deep for one afternoon to uproot entirely. That fear. It had been 3 years in the building, and it would be some time in the going. But it was different now. It had been sat on by something larger. There was a daughter in the room and a wife who was all right and a window open onto August in Wyoming, and those things were more present than the fear. That was enough. That was, in fact, considerably more than enough. They named her Ruth, which was Eliza's maternal grandmother's name, and Colton said it suited her, and Eli came home from Dunmore's and stood at the bedroom door with the expression of someone who has been waiting for intelligence from the front and is processing the information as it arrives. "Is she loud?" he asked. "Very," Eliza said. "Dunmore said babies are loud. Dunmore is right about most things." Eli came closer, slowly, with the dignity of someone who has decided to approach a situation with proper caution. He looked at his sister with the focused attention he gave to things that required understanding. "She's very small," he said. "She'll get bigger," Eliza said. "They do. What do I do with her now?" "Right now, nothing. Later you'll talk to her and show her things, the same way you showed me things when I got here." He looked at Eliza, then at the baby. "Like the horses." "Like the horses," she said. "She'll need someone to teach her." Something moved through Eli's expression. The specific, complicated thing she had first seen in a barn in winter when she'd suggested he could teach her to ride. The recognition that he was necessary, that there was a job here that was specifically his. "Okay," he said, with the gravity of someone accepting a commission. "I can do that." Arabella and Josephine arrived in September on a Thursday afternoon, when the summer had turned and the air had that particular fall quality, clear and cold-edged and honest, that Eliza had come to associate with the ranch at its most itself. She heard the wagon from Garnet Creek and went to the porch to meet it, and she saw her sisters come down from it and felt the strange doubled quality of that moment. Seeing people she had known her entire life in a place they had never been, like two images that didn't quite overlap. Arabella looked the way she always looked, beautiful, poised, taking in her surroundings with the attentive expression of someone who is accustomed to commanding rooms and is recalibrating for an outdoor context. She looked at the ranch house, at the yard, at the mountains behind it, and then she looked at Eliza, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed her face that was not composure, something genuine. "Eliza?" she said. "Arabella," Eliza said. They looked at each other across the yard. Josephine came around the side of the wagon more slowly. She was thinner than Eliza remembered, and something in her face had changed in a year. Not aged exactly, but altered, the sharp quickness of it quieter than it used to be. She looked at Eliza with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing something and has now arrived at the place where they have to actually say it, and is finding the rehearsal insufficient. "You look well," she said. Her voice was careful. "I am well," Eliza said. A pause. The ranch yard was quiet around them. One of the horses moved in the corral. The baby, somewhere inside, made a sound that carried through the front window. Josephine looked at the window. "That's Ruth," Eliza said. "Come inside. I'll introduce you." She did not hug either of them. Not yet. That would come or it wouldn't, and she was not going to force the shape of it before it was ready. She brought them inside and she showed them her home, the clean kitchen and the organized shelves and the fiddle on its shelf in the sitting room and the account ledgers on the desk. And she let all of it be what it was, the visible evidence of a life built rather than inherited. Arabella walked through the sitting room with her hands clasped in front of her and her face doing something complicated. "It's lovely," she said, and she meant it, which Eliza could hear because Arabella was not a woman who bothered to mean things she said for courtesy's sake. "It's really, Eliza, this is really something." "It needed work when I arrived," Eliza said. "Most things do." She did not say this with a point on it. She just said it, which was worse and also better because it was true and they all knew it was about more than the house. Colton came in from the range that evening and met them with the contained directness that was simply how he was, which Arabella found slightly alarming for about 20 minutes, and then, Eliza observed, genuinely interesting. He shook Josephine's hand with the specific expression of a man who has decided he will be civil because his wife has asked it of him, and not for any other reason, which Josephine received with remarkable composure for someone who deserved considerably worse. Dinner that evening was the most interesting meal the Hale Ranch table had hosted. Eli asked Arabella where she got her hair from, which was a purely scientific question he considered entirely appropriate, and Arabella answered it with more grace than Eliza had expected, asking him questions in return about the ranch that he answered with authority and some embellishment. Josephine was quieter than usual, watchful, the sharpness turned inward for once. After dinner, when Colton had taken Eli up to bed, and Arabella had gone to the guest room with the headache of a woman who has been traveling and is processing significant information, Eliza and Josephine were left at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea and the quiet of the ranch night around them. They sat for a while without speaking. It was not an easy silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have something between them that has to be handled and are deciding who goes first. Josephine went first. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not the kind in the letter." Eliza looked at her. "What I did was cruel," Josephine said. "I knew it was cruel when I did it, and I did it anyway because I wanted—" She stopped. "Because I wanted to feel like I'd done something, like I had power over something. That doesn't explain it. It just—" She shook her head. "It was wrong. You didn't deserve it." Eliza held her cup in both hands and looked at her sister. This person she had known her whole life, who had always been sharper and quicker and more dangerous than kind. And she thought about what to say. She had the speech. She had constructed it over a year, accurate and specific, and with the weight of everything it was owed. She set it down. "I know," she said, "and I know you know. That's enough." Josephine looked at her. "That's it? What else do you want? I'm not going to punish you. You're not going to punish yourself forever either, because that's its own kind of self-indulgence." She set her cup down. "You did a cruel thing, and it sent me somewhere I belonged. I've spent a year deciding what to do with that. What I've decided is that I'm not carrying it. You can carry your part of it however you need to, but I'm not adding mine." Josephine was very still. Her eyes were bright. "You've changed," she said. "I haven't changed," Eliza said. "I've always been exactly this. You just weren't looking." The silence after that was different. After a while, Josephine said quietly, "She would have loved this place. Mama would have hated it, but she would have loved it." "You should tell her that," Eliza said. "Write her a letter about it. Tell her what you see." She looked at her sister. "She never saw me, Joe, but that's not entirely her fault. She was looking somewhere else her whole life. You can tell her to look." Josephine wiped her eye with the back of her wrist in the quick, private way of someone who does not cry in front of people and is not going to start now. "You're going to make me feel worse than the apology did," she said. "Good," Eliza said, and there was enough warmth in it that it wasn't unkind. They stayed at the table until the fire burned down, and it was not a reconciliation exactly. It was something more honest than that. 2 complicated women with a complicated history starting the slow work of building something new on top of the old ground, without pretending the old ground wasn't there. It was enough. It was, for now, more than enough. Her sisters stayed 4 days. On the last morning, Arabella held Ruth in the sitting room with the careful competence of a woman who knows how to hold babies and was doing so with more feeling than she usually allowed herself. She looked down at this niece she had not known existed 4 days ago, and something in her face was unguarded in a way Eliza had not seen before. "She has your eyes," Arabella said. "She has her father's stubborn chin," Eliza said. "She's beautiful. She's loud and she doesn't sleep when I need her to, and she is the best thing I've ever done," Eliza said. "So yes, beautiful." Arabella looked at her sister over the baby. "I didn't see you," she said, simply, directly. Not as apology, they were past apologies, but as acknowledgement, the specific kind that lands differently because it names the exact thing. "I know," Eliza said. "I see you now." "I know that too," Eliza said. "Come back next spring. Eli will have taught Ruth to point at the horses by then, and it'll be more interesting." Arabella laughed. A genuine laugh, not the performed one, the one that was actually hers, and handed the baby back, and that was as much as could be rebuilt in 4 days, which was not nothing. The wagon from Garnet Creek took them away in the early morning, and Eliza stood on the porch and watched it go and felt the particular feeling of something completed. Not resolved in every detail, not made simple, not rewritten into a better story than it had been. Completed. The shape of it finished, even if the relationship inside the shape would continue to be what relationships were: imperfect, ongoing, requiring maintenance. She had Colton beside her on the porch. "Josephine," he said. Not a question exactly. "She's working on it," Eliza said. "Is that enough?" She thought about it honestly. "For now," she said. "People work on things at their own pace. I can't do it for her." He put his arm around her, which he did now with the ease of something that had become habitual without anyone deciding to make it habitual. And they stood and watched the wagon until it was gone around the road bend, and the ranch was just the ranch again. The horses in the corral and the mountains in the distance, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney going straight up into the still fall air. Inside, Eli was feeding Ruth her morning bottle with the focused seriousness of someone who has been entrusted with an important operation and is not going to drop the ball on it. They had worked up to this slowly, Eliza staying close at first, then less close, then present in the kitchen doing other things while Eli managed. He was good at it. He talked to Ruth while he fed her, not baby talk, but the normal running commentary of a 9-year-old informing his sister about the world, which Ruth received with the profound calm of someone who has not yet learned to disagree. Eliza came in and watched from the doorway. "She burped," Eli said with satisfaction. "Good," Eliza said. "That's important." "I know," he said. "I read the chapter." He had in fact read the relevant chapter of the medical guide she kept on the kitchen shelf twice on his own initiative before agreeing to take on the feeding rotation. This was so entirely Eli that she had not commented on it at the time and simply left the book where it was and trusted him to find it. "You're good at this," she told him. He looked up from the baby. The wariness that had been in his eyes when she arrived was entirely gone. Had been gone for months, really. It had left so gradually she hadn't noticed its absence until she thought about its presence, which was how it was supposed to go. "She's easy," he said. "She just wants to eat and be warm." "Most people do," Eliza said, "when you get down to it." He considered this with the expression he used for things he was going to think about later. Then he returned his attention to Ruth, who had something to say about the bottle situation, and the kitchen was full of the ordinary sounds of a morning that was just a morning. The stove, and the baby, and the boy, and the mountains outside the window doing their ancient, indifferent, beautiful thing. Eliza had been in Wyoming territory for 1 year. She had arrived on a train platform in the thin autumn light with 1 trunk and $14 and the name of a man she'd never met, and she had arrived specifically because her sisters thought she was the kind of person things like this could be done to without consequence, the kind of person whose name could be written down as a joke. What she knew now, standing in her kitchen in the fall of her 2nd Wyoming year, was something she'd always known and had simply been prevented from proving, that the people who underestimate you are not seeing you clearly. They are seeing a story they've told themselves, a category they've placed you in, a verdict they handed down before the evidence was in. And the verdict says nothing about you. It says everything about the limits of what they were willing to see. She had not become someone different out here. She had not been transformed by hardship or love or the Wyoming landscape into a better or stronger version of herself. She had simply been somewhere that required her to be exactly who she already was, and she had been it, fully, without apology. And it had been enough. More than enough. She looked at the ring on her finger. She thought about the letter she had written in 4 drafts at the parlor desk, the one she'd mailed before she could think too carefully. She thought about the train pulling out of Missouri in the early morning and the particular quality of not looking back. She thought about a man at a train platform who said, "You're smaller than I expected," and a woman who said, "Most people are," and both of them understanding, already, that they were the kind of people who could handle each other. She thought about a 7-year-old boy in a bird's nest and a fiddle on a shelf. She thought about a blizzard and a sealed door and the specific price of telling the truth in the dark. She thought about a daughter named Ruth, currently being held by her brother with professional concentration, who had her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubborn chin and absolutely no idea yet what kind of people she had come from, which was all right because there was time for that. There was a lot of time for that. Eliza intended to be here for all of it. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains were doing what the mountains always did, being enormous and old and completely unmoved by anything happening at their feet, which she had come to find not indifferent, but honest. The world was large and mostly did not concern itself with individual human stories. That was not cruelty. That was proportion. You found your piece of it and you made it real and you held on to it with both hands and you didn't wait for the world to confirm that it mattered. It mattered because you built it. It mattered because you chose it. She had chosen this. All of it. The hard land and the hard man and the work and the fear and the slow trust and the love that arrived not as a revelation but as a fact she one day simply knew. She had been called plain. She had been called overlooked. She had been used as a punchline by people who loved her badly and saw her worse. And she had taken that punchline and she had carried it 2,000 miles west and she had planted it in difficult soil and she had tended it through a hard winter, and what it had grown into was this: a kitchen full of morning light, a daughter, a son who was not hers by blood and was entirely hers by everything that mattered, a husband who was learning every day to keep a door open, a ranch that ran well and would keep running, and a life that fit her, finally, the way things fit when they've been made rather than inherited. The forgotten daughter had become the cornerstone, not because anyone had finally seen her, because she had never stopped being worth seeing. That was the thing, in the end. That was the whole of it. Not that the world had changed its mind about her, not that she had earned some final approval that justified all the years of being overlooked. The world did not owe her that recognition, and she did not need it. What she needed, she had found. Not here, not in Wyoming, not in Colton's kitchen, or Eli's growing trust, or Ruth's gray eyes, but in herself, in the woman who had written a fourth draft at the parlor desk and walked to town before she could think too carefully and handed the letter over and not looked back. That woman had been there all along. She had been there in Missouri, doing the accounts that kept the farm running and being thanked for nothing and doing them anyway. The frontier had not made her. It had simply given her room. She turned from the window and went back to her kitchen and her children and the ordinary morning that was her life. And it was enough. It was, in every way that counted, exactly enough. And in the end, that is all any of us are really looking for. Not to be rescued by a place or a person, but to finally find the space where who we already are turns out to be precisely what was needed all along.